was taught by Mr. Mirza, and this one is the second one by me. I'm going to just give you an overview of what we talked about last time, and we'll continue. And if you have any questions, so I'll be happy to answer them at the end. So I have, by the way, so I'm not very prepared today. I'm honest with you, because we had a big event yesterday, and I was focused on that, and it finished around 7 p.m. And I prepared some of my notes, but I hope that I have some other notes which are in Persian. I need to translate them on the on the air. So I hope that is okay. All right. So last time we talked about the biography of Ferdowsi. I briefly talked about him, but it was not that deep. I'm going to go way deeper today. So you know this man way better today, especially from his own words. And that is the key in our conversation today. But after that brief biography, I talked about Ferdowsi's legacy. I told you that there are three main legacies of Ferdowsi. One of them is the saving of Persian language. He saved the language through his work. And I told you why it mattered and why it helped a lot in saving the language is because people read his book. People narrated his stories and his poems because people cared about them. And that was the third legacies, which was about narrating the story of the past. And story of the past as people believe to be their real history. In fact, when we want to talk about Shahnameh, we say Shahnameh is the oral, the mythical, and to some extent, the real history of Iran. That's the way that I define the content of Shahnameh. And I told you about the word historia, which is the root of the two words story and history. And that is the true meaning of myth. These are the stories that have some root in the history, or they are the history told as stories. And I gave you some examples how some of these stories that we read in Shahnameh can have some root in the past. I told you about Zahak and maybe the droughts and maybe the bad kings or bad situation in people's life in general, that people interpreted that as 1,000 years of darkness, the era of Zahak. Yeah, and then I told you about the second one. I skipped the second one because this is the order that Dr. Mushtaq Meinavi talks about his legacies, Ferdowsi's legacies. So the second one after the basically Persian language and the stories of the past is the Persian poetry itself, and how Ferdowsi built a very good foundation for Persian poetry. He set a bar so that all good poems can be evaluated against that. And that is something that I told you that is a bit hard, to be honest, to talk about in this class, which is in English, but still I do my best anyway. So I'll try to talk about some of the beautiful things in his words, and that so shows how strong his words were and how people love to recite his poems. All right, after that, I told you about myth itself and the root of myth and where they come from. For Iranian myths, they come from Avesta above anything else. I told you about different parts of Avesta, and especially I highlighted Yashts. Yashts are rich in that regard. And I told you that Yashts are basically there are two parts or types of Yashts. Some of them are way old, even pre-Zarathustra era. And those stories come from that. So especially the first part of Shahnameh, any story that you read, you can go and search it in Avesta. Obviously, they're not exactly the same. Some of them have differences. Some of them have significant differences. So one of the examples I gave you was the story of Qumars, where Qumars is the first man, or even the prototype of a man, in Avesta, in Yasht. But when we or actually it's not in Yasht. Qumars is not in Yasht, so I correct that. You can find the story of Qumars in Bundeheshn, which is a Middle Persian text. But I told you that Bundeheshn and Dinkard, especially these two books, are believed to come from parts from Avesta itself. But we don't have the entire collection of Avesta pieces, so we don't know whether it was truly in Avesta or not, but it's quite possible. But the story of Qumars, where in our old references, we see him as the first man, but in Shahnameh, he's the first king. That's one of the examples. There are other differences too. So if I get a chance, when I tell you the stories of Shahnameh, I'm going to just review the entire book for you. As part of that, I briefly touch on some of these differences. Anyway, then I told you about the history of Iran a bit. I told you about Aryans who migrated to the south, and they were divided into two parts, Iranians and Indians. So they are all cousins. And also the Europeans who basically split off from this branch of family way earlier, even more than 1,000 years earlier. That's why we are a bit farther away from the family tree, from the Europeans. However, there are still some commonalities between the two. And I told you that we know that all these people were part of the same group, same tribe, same civilization, because of two things. One is their languages, which have very good similarities. And I told you that even Avestan and Sanskrit are like two different dialects of the same language. And the other thing is their myths. Their myths have these common stories, especially between the stories in Iranian myths and the Indian. There are a lot of similarities, a lot of stories. There's a story of Zahak, believe it or not, we have it also in the Indian myths, but it's way different. It's not about just a man with two serpents on his shoulders, but it's a story of just a dragon, something like that. Even though we have also the dragon story in Avesta, in Yasht. And that is one of the other differences between Ferdowsi's Shahnameh and Yasht. Over time, this creature, which was described in Yasht as a dragon with 3 heads and 6 eyes. So these are the stories, the definition of that dragon, but that changed over time. And by the time that we had Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, that is a story of a man with 2 snakes, 2 serpents. And then you can count. So yeah, there's 6 eyes and 3 heads. But it was maybe hard to believe for people in the newer era that such a creature existed. So that's maybe the time when they changed that story from that dragon into this man. Anyway, so after talking briefly about Persian texts, it's the Iranian text. I don't call them Persian. So yeah, Persian languages is another story that we can talk about another time. So we have 2 branches of Iranian languages. One of them comes from Avesta, and the other one comes from ancient Persian, which then becomes Middle Persian and the modern Persian, which is the language we have today. And Avesta is another branch that we have, basically Avesta, we have Gata. These are the texts that we have from that language. So it's correct to say that these are, I talked about the Iranian texts, not necessarily the Persian ones, because Avesta is obviously not Persian. And then I told you about Khodainames, how Khodainames were were collected during the Sasanian era. And then after that, at the time of Abu Mansur Abdul Razzaq, who was the ruler of Khorasan, He ordered these books, which were scattered, and we were kind of, some of them were even lost after the Arabs attacks. He ordered them to be collected. So he asked Mubads to come collect those and translate those, not just collect them, but translate them. And then they turned that into a book. We call it Shahnameh of Abu Mansur today, which, as I mentioned last time, the only part of it which we have today is just its introduction, because it happened to be included in the Shahnameh Ferdowsi for ages. So this is what I told you about. And I also mentioned that Shahnameh of Abu Mansur, some believe it was the sole reference of Ferdowsi. This is something that we cannot say for sure, but I think the accepted belief today by many scholars is that Shahnameh Abu Mansur was the main source, maybe the only source. But even if it was not the only source of Ferdowsi for his book, the number of stories which come from other sources were very few. So if I just want to throw a number, maybe 80-90% of it comes from this book, maybe 10% from other places. And again, some people believe that that percentage is zero. And Ferdowsi himself says it in his book. I'm going to talk about it today, that I got this book and I turned it into poetry. That's it. He doesn't say that, oh, by the way, I had some other references. Even though, so one of the things which might have created this misunderstanding is that some of the, in some of the stories, Ferdowsi mentions that I heard from a wise man or something like that. Or sometimes said that, okay, the researcher of the ancient past says this. But and some people say, oh, says, it means that somebody came and said it to Ferdowsi. But no, that says is just figurative. It says means that says in this book. That's the way that we can interpret it. All right, so that was about Shahnameh Abu Mansur, which was the end of our conversation last time. And today I'm going to talk about the content of Shahnameh, what is in it. But before that, I want to tell you the story of Ferdowsi's life or biography as we know from some other sources. I mentioned briefly last time that we cannot know the true life of Ferdowsi because 1,000 years has passed. And Ferdowsi also was a very well-known person and people loved him and his work. And when you are in that situation, people create stories around your life. Legends that are not only about Ferdowsi, from many other great figures, even Zarathustra himself or Cyrus the Great or others. Ferdowsi was no exception. And some of these stories are easily refuted, and I'll talk about at least one of them today. However, some others we don't know, but they look unbelievable. So they do not sound real. So I give you one example. So the famous history book, the father of history, is Herodotus. And it's his book. He talks about real people, including Cyrus the Great. Many of the things we know from, or we think we know from Cyrus's life, comes from that book. Because Herodotus goes into detail of his story, but is very unrealistic, very unbelievable. So maybe at some point I'll talk about that story. However, if somebody, especially in that era, maybe ages ago, claims that it's talking about history, that doesn't mean that that was real. The way that history was narrated back then was completely oral. And some of them, including Herodotus, and some of the people, one of the people I talk about today, actually said that I heard from this guy, who has heard it from this guy, who has heard it from someone else. So obviously we cannot trust that. But before talking about um, before referring to Shahnameh itself, let's talk about two other main sources that we have from, which are more uh, are older than others. The first um, reference that we have from Ferdowsi's life is the history of Sistan. That book is from around 1060. So it's about maybe 50 years after Shahnameh was finished, or maybe 40 years after Ferdowsi's life. And the part that he talks about Ferdowsi is very brief. And it talks about just a conversation between Ferdowsi and Sultan Mahmud. And I'm sure that you've heard this story that Sultan Mahmud says that, oh, your book is nothing but the story of Rostam. And I have a lot of Rostam in my army. And Ferdowsi says that, oh, I don't know about your army, but I know that the God is created only one and only one Rostam. And there's nobody like Rostam. جهان آفرین تا جهان آفرید سواری چو رستم نیامد پدید. So this is the famous verse that they tell when they narrate this story, even though this verse is not in the history of Sistan, but it is the same meaning. And he says that, oh, after saying this, Ferdowsi walked out, and Sultan Mahmud talked to his advisor, said, oh, what did he say? Did he insult me? And they said, yeah, he did. And he orders to go and catch Ferdowsi, but Ferdowsi disappeared and nobody could find him. So this is the story that we hear in History of Sistan, which, by the way, we don't know who even wrote that book. It's a very important book, but nobody knows who wrote it. And we just guessed that it was maybe around 1060 and that this book was written. But the other book, which is very famous, and many of these stories that you know today comes from that book, is the book named Chahar Maqale, 4 Discourses, by Nizami Arusi. And this guy lived 100 years after Ferdowsi. He was born on the 100th anniversary of Ferdowsi finishing Shahnameh. 1110 AD. So he says that Ferdowsi was from a village named Paj, which was from the Tabaran area of Tus. So this is quite possibly is true. And then he says that he was wealthy. He came from a wealthy family. We know that that's true as well. He says that he had one daughter. We know that certainly this is not correct, because he talks about his son. Ferdowsi talks about his son, but this guy says that he had only one daughter, and he was hoping to get money by writing this book, to find a sponsor, get some money, and then pay for his daughter's jahaz or jahiziyeh. I don't know how to translate that in English. Jahiziyeh is usually something that they buy for the bride when he goes. When she goes to the groom's house. So when they marry, they take something with them. So what is the word on that? I don't know. Just write it in the chat if you know what the word is. I don't. But anyways, what they say is that Ferdowsi wanted to basically get money, and he devoted 25 years of his life, according to Nizami Arusi, 25 years, just for this purpose. It's very interesting. So people make fun of this argument today. Can you imagine what did others do, by the way? Did everybody write a book for their daughter? Oh, how hard it was for people to get married back then. Okay, so let me take a look at the chat. Dory, or Dory, or something like that. Okay, cool. Thank you. I'll look it up. And then please type the name of the second reference about the life of Ferdowsi. The 4 Discourses. Yes, the 4 Discourses was the second one. The first one was the history of Sistan. Sistan is the land of Rostam. Rostam and Zal and Sam, all of those guys come from Sistan. So, and in that book tells the story of those folks. And again, this is a mythical story, but back then they believed that it was the history of the land. And as part of that, he touches on Shahnameh Ferdowsi as well. So in the book. Okay. So let's continue what Nizami Arusi says about Ferdowsi. He says that he had great poetry skills. And he just gives some example and says that these words are beautiful. And I've seen no other Persian poet who can say such strong and beautiful words. And then he says something very strange. He says that I've seen rarely among Arabs to have such beautiful words. So in that sense, Nizami Arusi believed that Arabs have better poetry than Persians. For some reason, he believed that, and he mentions it. But even for that, he said that Ferdowsi is better than most of them. And then he talks about a few people who, one of them was the person who wrote Shahnameh for Ferdowsi. The other one was the narrator. So this is apparently the way it worked, that Ferdowsi just gave his writings to somebody narrated that, and there were some people whose job was to write books, and they wrote that. So, and he says the name of these people, and we know them, Ali Deilam and Budalaf. We know these two, and this is correct, because as Nizami Arusi says it, Ferdowsi talks about these people. The name of these two guys are at the end of Shahnameh, and he appreciates them for what they do. For what they did for him. And then Ferdowsi talks about a patron that he had, who was the person in charge of collecting taxes in Tus. He was a patron of him, and he gave him some discounts. Ferdowsi says that I don't know anything about taxes, but I know that this guy gives me discounts. Ferdowsi says it. And Nizami Arusi narrates that. So we know that that's true because Ferdowsi says that in the book. So then Nizami Arusi starts telling these weird stories that Sultan Mahmud heard the poem, read the book, and asked the advisors how much to give this guy. And they say, give him 50,000 silver coins. And he said, okay. And they said that because he's a Shia, he's not Sunni, which was the religious religion of Sultan Mahmud, and Ferdowsi was Shia. Said, okay, so he is not one of us. So give him 50,000 silver coins. And Sultan Mahmud said, okay. And he did that. And Ferdowsi was offended. And by the way, they say that it was pretty funny. Maybe corruption was that bad back then. Say that out of these 50,000, only 20,000 reached Ferdowsi. What happened to that 30,000? But anyway, they said that 20,000 was given to him, and then Ferdowsi went to the bathhouse, and then he shared it, or basically just distributed it among the bartender. He basically drank, and he gave it to the bartender and the bathhouse clerk. This is what Nizami says. Give it to these guys, and then he escaped to Tabaristan. Why escape? But apparently he escaped. Maybe what he did was offensive to the king. Who knows? He escaped to Tabaristan, which is Mazandaran today. And he went to another king at that land and dedicated his book to that king. But that king refused because he was afraid of Sultan Mahmud. He said that, oh, you'd better go and patch up with Sultan Mahmud. And then now we know, we hear the story of the satire or scolding of Sultan Mahmud. So you might have heard about that. There's a conception that Ferdowsi, after was not treated by Sultan Mahmud, he wrote 100 verses, 100 lines of poetry to scold Sultan Mahmud. And Nizami Arusi says that the king of Tabaristan said that, okay, I buy these poetry from you. He was so afraid. He said that, okay, I buy it from you. And he bought and destroyed those. verses, and there are only 6 verses are survived to this day, according to him. And he mentions those 6 verses in Char Magale, in 4 discourses. And then he continues the story. These are stories, don't believe them. But he continues saying that at some point, Sultan Mahmud went to India. We know that Sultan Mahmud attacked India and got a lot of riches from there and just returned them back home. And he said that on the way back, he arrived at a fortress, and he gave an order to the ruler of that fortress to surrender. And he sent a messenger, and he was waiting for the response. And in response, the guy, the ruler, wrote a single verse of poetry. He says, "Agar just be kam man ayad jawab, man o gurz o meydan o afrasiyab," which means, if I hear a response other than desired, there will be only me, my weapon, the war field, and Afrasiyab, the king of Turan, from Shahnameh. And then Sultan Mahmud said, that was deep. Who wrote that? And they said, oh, it's from Ferdowsi. And he said, really? That guy? Oh, maybe I need to give him some more money. And then that's the story that Nizami says, oh, he changed his mind. And then said, oh, give him 60,000 gold coins. And then they put all the coins on top of camels, and they sent him to Tus. And as they entered one city gate, the corpse of Ferdowsi was out of the other gates. And this is where we hear this story from Nizami Aruzi. You all heard it. So it comes from this source. It's just a story. There was nobody just right at the same time in the 2 sides of the city. Oh, this entered, this exited. This is just interesting stories that people love to say. And also, Nizami mentions that Ferdowsi was not allowed to be buried at the Muslim cemetery. This is also according to Nizami Aruzi. And he was buried in his own personal garden. So this is the gist of what we hear about Ferdowsi's life from Nizami Aruzi, which is one of the ancient sources, the oldest sources that we have from his life. However, Nizami himself is a special, interesting character, and he has stories from other people as well. He talks about Rudaki, and he has a very beautiful story about Rudaki as well. I don't have time to tell you that story, but that is also very beautiful. But there are some of his stories that we already know as a fact that they are not real. So that's why people say, oh, this guy is exaggerated. Do not count on him and whatever he says. Do not believe that. However, there is one very important point that he mentions is in 4 discourses, Char Magale. That is absolutely true. And I'm going to talk about that as part of today's lecture. And that is that Ferdowsi decided to write Shahnameh. Ferdowsi himself did that. See, it wasn't a ridiculous reason that this guy brought up, oh, just to buy something for his daughter as a bride. But he said that he decided to do this. Sultan Mahmud did not order Ferdowsi to write the book. Please, please, anybody that you see around you, please tell them that. It's absolutely false, and we know that, and it's very easily refuted. I'll easily prove that wrong to you today. But, so let's move on from these 2 sources, and let's go to the best source that I personally trust, and that is Ferdowsi himself. People say things that are not 100% true, and we cannot prove them, even some of them right or wrong. But these are the stories, and they come at least 100 years after Ferdowsi, or several hundred years later. We cannot trust them. However, the book of Shahnameh itself, we can rely on. And that is also, again, with some caveats. So hopefully in one of the next lectures, we have 2 more lectures left. I hope I get a chance to talk about the versions of Shahnameh. So we know that Shahnameh, I mentioned that last time, that the oldest Shahnameh is from 200 years after Ferdowsi's death. So we cannot make sure that all of these verses that we have today are just by Ferdowsi himself. There were reasons that people wanted to add to this book. I'll talk about that later. So we cannot trust for sure. However, there are scholars, there are very good scholars like Dr. Khalegi Motlaq, who has created a great edition of Shahnameh, he's researched it for 45 years, more than the time that Ferdowsi devoted to writing that book. He did a lot of research. He compared all different versions that we have from Shahnameh today, all the old ones, and he came up with this edition. So that's what I'm relying on. So still possible that some of the verses are not actually from the book, but usually there are verses that are sensitive and people want to add to Shahnameh. For example, about his religion. We don't know that for sure because that is a sensitive topic. People wanted to align Ferdowsi with their own ideology. And that is quite possible for them to add some verses in that part to say that, oh, this is my belief. See, this was also Ferdowsi's belief. And this can be easily done by adding a few verses to Shahnameh and write them in one of the versions that you are writing yourself, or somebody writes for you. Or there are things that there are verses that is not not today, that is not part of any version of Shahnameh that we have today, but people write it and they put it in social media and they circulate it around as it was in Shahnameh. And what is that about? The hatred of Ferdowsi with regards to Arabs and some even Muslims. We know that these are not even part of it. You cannot find a single book of Shahnameh today that has these verses. Ferdowsi has some verses about Arabs by Rostam Farrokhzad, the army commander during the Sasanian era and the time that Iranians were at fight with Arabs. He has some words. We know about those, and some of those are actually pretty strong words against Arabs. But those are not the ones that you read in social media. They are very exaggerated. Say that, oh, Arabs are, I don't know, it's terrible, blah, 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 blah. That's not what was in Shahnameh. We have some words about Arabs in Shahnameh, but not those. That's what I'm saying, that there are parts of Shahnameh which are very ready to be twisted and added to. However, these parts that Ferdowsi talks about his life, says that, okay, I'm poor, I'm old, I'm tired, things like that. So why should people just add lines like this? And again, we just cannot rely on just what verse and perhaps likely or unlikely. We actually wanted to have proofs. And this is what Dr. Khalegi Motlaq and others do. They actually look at the ancient versions of Shahnameh and the manuscripts, and they also look at other sources. There are other sources. I hope that I get a chance to talk about them next time. And there are ways for us to figure out to some extent which bait or which verse is from Shahnameh. But anyway, what I'm saying is that I'm going to rely on this version of Shahnameh when I say that, okay, Ferdowsi said this or that. And I use that as a reference, assuming that that is true. All right, but before getting into those words, I wanted to tell you that in this class, I would like to look at Shahnameh, the contents of Shahnameh, from 3 different aspects. One of them is the stories, obviously. I'll talk about those stories, which I'm sure that many of you like that to hear those. And some of you said, oh, come on, too much introduction. This is not introduction. This is the content of the class. So you know these stories. So I don't want to dedicate 4 or 5 lectures to just talking about those stories. You know those stories, and you can read those stories from any reference, any translation. But I would like to talk about these aspects of Shahnameh Ferdowsi that you might not have heard from other sources. That's why I hope that you give me that benefit of the doubt to talk about these. So I'll talk about the stories. However, that would not be for this class. Maybe next time. But I would like to talk about Shahnameh from two other aspects as well. And again, the second one would also not be today, but I'll talk about them. The book of wisdom and advice. Ferdowsi has a lot of those in Shahnameh. And that is unique. I just tell you, that is unique. You do not find that in any other epic story from that era that has such notion. So you compare that to Iliad and Odyssey, even though Iliad is and Odyssey are a bit older. However, they just tell the stories of people killing each other. They do not want to give you advice. They are not words of wisdom, but Shahnameh is. I'll tell you about it. However, I want to tell you about the third aspect of the Shahnameh, the concept of Shahnameh today, as I mentioned, the Ferdowsi's biography. I had a lecture very recently in Persian that the title was Ferdowsi by Ferdowsi, or Ferdowsi according to Ferdowsi. What do we learn from Ferdowsi's life from his own words? And we learn a lot. And that is, again, something unique. Ferdowsi talks about himself in the middle of the story. It's pretty sweet. He talks about it, and then he pauses for a second, and then he says, okay, so at one point he talks about a day is the Ormazd of Bahman. And he talks about that day in a very sweet way, as if it was his birthday. We don't know about that. We are not sure. But the way he says it, he said that this Ormazd of Bahman is a special day for me. Bring wine. I want to have wine on this special day. So who knows? I was saying that if you want to just pick a day for Ferdowsi's birthday, this is a good day. Ormazd of Bahman, the first day of month Bahman. Because Ferdowsi says it. So, yeah, Ferdowsi does that a lot. Ferdowsi talks about his own life and some other, again, even advice and words of wisdom I told you, especially in the beginning of the stories. Many of Shahnameh's stories have a prologue, an introduction, a preface, in which Ferdowsi does amazing things. I cannot believe how he does it. He tells the story, the end of the story, he spoils the story, but in a very shrewd and mysterious and symbolic way. I give you one example. The story of Rostam and Sohrab, the story that everybody knows by heart. Rostam kills his son Sohrab. He starts the story by this narration. He says, tell me this, if a strong wind blows and it cuts a raw fruit, not ripe, raw fruit from a tree and drops it on the ground, is that just? Is that fair? What is fair? What is not fair? And if it's fair, why are you complaining about it? That's it. He talks about a tree and a fruit. But what is that fruit? What is that tree? We know that. A raw fruit is Sohrab. Sohrab is very young and is killed at a young age. And then he asks us this deep question in the beginning. How do you judge this story? How do you judge this incident? Was it just? Was it unjust? What does God do here? Why in the world does God want this? And he usually, and this is another interesting thing about Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi talks about two different things. There are kind of two different ideology, we can say, in Shahnameh. One is the ideology in which God is the creator, God is the almighty, powerful. And on the other hand, we have the word, the nature, what do we call it? So the heaven, I don't want to call it heaven. So Ruzegar, Char, these are the terms that he uses. Means that, okay, whatever that happens to us, if it's bad, it's not by God. is by our destiny, by our, I don't know, what the world and the nature does to us. This is the way that he says. And this is actually an ideology. For example, Zoroastrianism, which comes from Zoroastrianism to some extent, has some of these notions. And Ferdowsi at some point talks about that. So in this case, he doesn't say that, okay, God uh, uh, killed him. He doesn't say that. But he says that you're crying. Why are you crying? Why are you screaming from this? This is just. Or do you think that is just? He asked this kind of question in this prologue of Rostam Sohram. And there are other stories that he, again, in this very mysterious way, talks about either the book, either the story itself, or about his own life. In one of the stories, I think, I don't remember which one now, so let me just find that for you from my notes. Yeah, in the prologue of Hormozd of Nushirvan, the son of Nushirvan, Anushirvan, Khosrow the First, we know him as this king in the history, the Sasanian king. His son. In the introduction of that story, he talks to his beloved, who apparently has passed away. He says that, oh, my beloved, my dear, where are you? I'm missing you. He says that it's a time of Mehregan celebration. By the way, Ferdowsi talks a lot about Mehregan, Sadeh, and Nowruz, about these three. A lot, so many times. I have, again, another lecture on those, but again, unfortunately in person. So I hope that we can talk about it at some point. But he said that, okay, I would like to have you with me today, but you're not here. And I'm here today, and you do not see anything from me after my death, something like that. Again, in a mysterious way. He does not say that my lady. It doesn't say that. It says Negara, Bahara, my spring, and my beloved. And so we can even argue that, oh, maybe he talks about his own youth. He's missing his own young age. Who knows? But again, it's mysterious, and this is one of this. But these are things that we can speculate from. At least there is something that we can talk about. And now that I'm talking about his wife potentially, or his beloved, I need to mention another prologue in which he talks about his beloved again. And that is certainly from his young age. And many believe that this particular story is the story that Ferdowsi started before starting Shahnameh formally. And that is the story of Bijan and Manije, the love story between Bijan and Manije. In the prologue of that story, Ferdowsi talks about a mysterious night. There was one night. It was a strange night, and he talks about the howl of the animals and some other sounds that he hears. He talks about this maybe not a very good night for him to begin with. He says that I was sleepless, and then I asked a beloved that I had in my house, which we can say that it was his wife, to bring a candle, to light a candle and bring some food so they can talk, and bring wine. And then he asks her to read a story for him from the book. What book? He doesn't say. But based on what we know today and what we know about from the Shahnameh's introduction that I'm going to talk to you about shortly, this book is book of Shahnameh of Abu Mansur, the book that he wanted to write or turn to poetry. So he says bring me the book and read me a story. And she says, okay, I'll do that. But you should turn that into poetry with your beautiful words. If you do that, I would appreciate it. And Ferdowsi said, sure, my lovely lady. We know this lady. It doesn't say the word lady there, but again, he praises her in some other beautiful words. He says that I'll do that. So there are other reasons that people or scholars bring today about why this story was perhaps the first story that he wrote. One of the things, it was from the style of his writing. There are a few words in it that are still a bit more, a bit older, and you see very faint signs of being immature, an immature poet. So there are some aleph, so at the end of some of the verses that makes it easy for you to create qafiyeh, the rhyme at the end of words. So I don't know. So let me just make up something. Let's say words this and that, right? These two do not rhyme, right? But if you say these are, that are, they rhyme, right? And this is something that he does in some of his verses, especially in this story. And many immature poets write poetry like that. They add this "ah" at the end to make the two words that do not rhyme by nature to rhyme. But Ferdowsi does it very rarely. Even in this story, he does it rarely. We have another famous Persian poet, Obeid Zakani. He writes a very long kind of satire story. It's called Mushan Gorbe or Cat and Mouse. And in this story, poetry, all the verses have these "ah" at the end. ای خردمند عاقل و دانا قصه موش و گربه بر خانا. So the two words at the end of this first verse of that poem is خردمند عاقل و دانا. Dana means wise. Yeah, it has an "ah" at the end. Dana, wise. And then the other one has bar khana. Bar khan means read. Doesn't have an "ah" at the end. So bar khana. He makes it rhyme like that. And he has a long story of cat and mouse like this. But Ferdowsi has it very rarely in Shahnameh in general, but more in this story than others. And that's one reason people believe that this was the first story that he narrated. And again, from the content of the prologue, we think that is also from his youth. So okay, so yeah, I mentioned that we hear about his beloved in two locations, two parts of the book, two prologues, and one of them is this, one of them is the other one that I told you about briefly, which is potentially about the time that maybe his wife passed away. Who knows? But he also he talks about another member of his family that he talks about him a lot in details at one location in Shahnameh. He talks about his son in the beginning of the story of Bahram Chubine. He says that my son has passed away. My young son has passed away. مرا سال بگذشت بر 65 نه نیکو بود گر بیازم به گنج مگر بهره برگیرم از پند خیش براندیشم از مرگ فرزند خیش. He says that I'm 65 years old. I'd better not think about riches and money anymore. I'd better listen to my own advice. He gives a lot of advice in the book. And now he says that I'd better listen to my own advice and think about the death of my son. And then he said, he says this, the age of his son when he died. He says that he was 37. And he says that It was my time. Why did he leave? It was my turn to die. But he left, and it seems that he's going to the other world, and he's waiting for me there. He's saving a place for me. And then this is a very ironic thing in Shahnameh. This is very, very amazing and remarkable. Ferdowsi narrates the story of many, many, many fathers and sons in Shahnameh. And many of these fathers mourn at the death of their sons. Rustam and Sohrab is one example. We have Kekavus and Siavash. We have Feridun and Iraj. We have many of those. And Ferdowsi writes those stories and narrates this sad scene very beautifully. He mourns with them. And this is again another thing unique about him, about Shahnameh. Ferdowsi talks about the stories as if they are happening before his eyes. He cries with them. He mourns with them. And he scolds the nature for their death. He says all of those things. He talks from his own side, and also he says the words that the father, for example, says about their own son, the dead son. But at some point, then he has to say the same words about his own son. And again, he says that beautifully. And there's one more thing that he says in this part of the book, that apparently there also has been some I don't know, bad blood, if it's the right word, or some disagreements between him and his son. He says that he was dorosht, he was bold with me. As again, very similar to many of the fathers and sons in Shahnameh. We know that Tur and Salm, the other two sons of Feridun, were also fighting with their father. They were against him, and they were arguing with him. So we know Gushtasp and Lohrasp. Gushtasp did the same thing with his father. And we had Siavash and Kekavus. We had stories like that. And it seems that it was the case for his own between him and his son too. Anyway, so these are the family members that he talks about. He doesn't talk about his daughter. We do not see any sign of that in the book. But there are a few other things I want to say today, but we are at the hour. Tell me if you want to hear it, or do you want to wait until next time? To be honest, I have a lot to say. I cannot cover them all in 4 classes, especially if you want to stop at this time. So I can
continue.
You guys want me to continue?
Yes.
Sure. Okay. Let's see, maybe 15, 20 more minutes, if you don't mind. Okay. So one of the things that we learn about Ferdowsi from Shahnameh is the story of Shahnameh itself. He talks about it in details, about how he came up with this idea of actually writing this book. What was in his mind, and what was the background? What I told you about Khodainameh, Shahnameh of Abu Mansur last time, it is in the book. Ferdowsi says it. In the introduction of Shahnameh, before Ferdowsi starts with the story of the first king, who's Kumars, he has a long introduction in which he first talks about the God, the praise, he praises the God and the wisdom. I'm going to hopefully again talk about that later, about the wisdom, which is a key word in Shahnameh. This is what I said in one of my lectures, that if you want to shrink the entire 50,000 verses of Shahnameh into one word, that is wisdom. Kherat. He praises Kherat, praises wisdom throughout the book. And he praises that in the beginning as well, because that is how important this word is to him. Kherat has a deep meaning and may not even be just wisdom, but maybe the best word that I came up with is wisdom. Others might have had other words, but he praises that. And then he talks about the creation. He talks about the creation of the sun and the moon and the people. And some people even get the idea of Big Bang from Ferdowsi's book. I'm not in that camp. I do not believe in that. They say that, okay, see this, that he said, oh, there was in the beginning, there was nothing, and there was something, and then it was something shiny, and then they said, oh, this was the Big Bang. So no, I don't believe in that. Even if it was, what was by accident? Ferdowsi was a human being at 1,000 years ago, and this idea of Big Bang, which is still argued about to this day, is not even 100-year-old. Come on, we didn't have it back then. So anyway, he talks about that, and then he talks about his religion, a few verses about that. Again, who knows whether it was true or not, because this is one of the sensitive topics that people quite possibly have altered it. And we even have some versions, the altered versions of that. Some, for example, Dr. Khalaghi says that, okay, this is not from him, this is not from him, this is not from him, this is from him. He said that, but others have other beliefs about this. So either some say that none of it is true, some of them all of it is correct, because by just adding a few verses, you can change Ferdowsi's religion. I know how much you know about the difference between Shia and Sunni. Shias believe in Muhammad's cousin Ali to be his successor. Sunnis believe that there were four of them: Abu Bakr, Omar, Osman, and then Ali. Ali was there, but there were three more. So if you add a few verses about Abu Bakr, Omar, and Osman in Shahnameh, Ferdowsi becomes Sunni. But if you remove those, he becomes Shia. See? That's why people over time, they did not like that he was Shia. Said, oh, let's make him Sunni. We are Sunni. Let's make him Sunni. Hey, they added some verses. I give you another example of this. So again, I'm rat holing, sorry. But there's another poet called Attar Neyshaburi, Attar of Neyshabur. He's also a giant of Persian poetry. And he was a Sunni. And in all of his books, he praises these four guys. He talks about these four successors of Muhammad, and he praises them in equal number of verses. 5 about this, 5 about him, 5 about him, 5 about him. And in another book, he says 10 about him, 10 about him. And then when you look at the later versions of his books, you see that those sentences or those verses about Abu Bakr, Umar, and Usman shrink. And then the ones about Ali are growing. Obviously, some people were changing those. They said, oh, we do not like. And then the words about Abu Bakr, said, oh, they were good guys. And they said, oh, what about Ali? Ali was amazing. So even the types of words about each one of them changes. It means that some people were trying to change his religion, even though we know that he was a devoted Sunni. Again, about the religions of Ferdowsi, we can make similar arguments, but No one knows for sure. I personally would say that it doesn't matter. Who cares what was his religion? What we care about is his masterpiece, Shahnameh, which is not about Islam, is not about any post-Islamic ideology, is about pre-Islamic era. The stories from the past, the stories of from before Islam, and the words of wisdom that we talk about, I mentioned, they're also about pre-Islamic philosophy, and they're more aligned with Avesta and Gotham. Anyway, so after he talks about his religion, then he tells the story of the book, and he starts from the beginning, from خداینامه. He says, یکی نامه بود از گه باستان، فراوان بدوی اندرون داستان، پراکنده در دست هر موبدی، از او بهره‌ای نزد هر بخردی. He says, there was a book from ancient times which included a lot of stories. It was scattered around, and every mubad had a piece of it. Ferdowsi says these words. He exactly defines خداینامه, even though he doesn't mention خداینامه, but this is exactly what it was. And then he talks about شاهنامه of Abu Mansur. He says, یکی پهلوان بود دهقان نژاد، دلیر و بزرگ و خردمند و راد، پژوهنده روزگار نخست، گذشته سخنها همه باز جست. ز هر کشوری موبدی سال خرد، بیاورد که نامه را گرد کرد. He says, there was a pahlavan. First of all, let me just define this word for you because this is very critical, what pahlavan means. There are two groups of people, the two main groups of people in Shahnameh, that Shahnameh talks about them. The first one is obviously the kings. Shahnameh is the story of the kings. And the story of pahlavans. Who were pahlavans? Pahlavans were mainly army commanders, we can say. So the noble members of an army, the most strong ones, they were each one of them leading a troop, and they were very brave, very strong. Some of them very exaggerated strong, like Rostam. They are called pahlavan. So the word that I use usually for these folks is hero. They were heroes. Pahlavan, I translate it as heroes. Some people have other words for it. And I do not call them superheroes, because when you compare them with Marvel superheroes, those superheroes had godlike powers. They are not humans. So Thor or Iron Man or others, Superman, they are not, they have extra, or I don't know, superhuman powers. But these guys were humans. They did not have any non-human features. So they were humans, but they were strong humans. Again, Rostam still can be a person that existed in the past. Rostam is strong, very strong. Stronger than anybody that you can imagine, but still, he's a human. He has 2 legs, 2 hands, a head, and that's it. He doesn't have any wing. He doesn't have any, I don't know, claws or whatever. He's just human. That's why I call them heroes. So, but hero is a very noble term that also used by Ferdowsi when he wants to praise somebody. And this is where he uses this word for Abu Mansur Abdul Razzaq, for the person, the ruler of Khorasan, who ordered the book. He says that there was a pahlavan from the Dehqan's root. I told you about Dehqans. He was from Dehqan's family, Abu Mansur as well. And this is another interesting fact about people of that era. A few hundred years after Islam, after the Sassanians were overthrown, people started to find their roots in the past. They even made them up. They created family trees for themselves. And they said that, oh, each one of these, Alebuye, Samanids, Ghaznavids, Ziyaris, they were all saying that, oh, we are from these guys. So some say that, okay, we are from King Ardashir, we are from Bahram Chubine, we are coming from, I don't know, Anushiravan. They wanted to tie themselves to those kings or heroes from the Iran's past. And because they wanted to say that we are nobles and we are authentic. And Abu Mansur was one of those two. Abu Mansur also claimed to be one of from those roots. And Ferdowsi says that in his book. He says that he was from the Dekhan's roots and he was Pahlavan. And he said that he wanted to find and collect the ancient words. And he gathered mubats from various countries, from various locations, and asked them to restore this book, Khodaynameh. And they did that. So Ferdowsi clearly says it. And as I mentioned, the exact same narration, same story is also in the introduction of Abu Mansur's Shahnameh. So these two align. So that's why we can be even more sure that Shahnameh of Abu Mansur was created by Mubads at that time, and it was the reference of Ferdowsi. Because Ferdowsi says, after he talks about this book, he says, he talks about Daqiqi, that the first person who says, I'm going to turn this book into poetry. And he said that he was young, he was energetic, he had beautiful words, even though later on in the book, he says, oh, he was not a great poet. I mentioned that last time. But in the introduction, he says that he was actually a good poet. He was. It wasn't as good as Ferdowsi, but he was relatively good poet. But he said that he started writing the book in poetry, but he was killed by a slave. Ferdowsi mentions that he was killed by a slave, and his work was unfinished. And then he says, after his death, I believe that I need to continue his work, but I did not have the book. Ferdowsi said that I didn't have Shahnameh of Abu Mansur, and I searched for it a lot. I didn't know where to find it until a good friend of mine came to me and said that I bring you the book. I bring you the book because I love what you want to do. I really love the idea of continuing Daqiqi's work because your words are beautiful, because you are a strong poet. Ferdowsi says that according to his friend, he was a good poet. And this is also something that we need to pause on a bit and think about it. Ferdowsi was a great poet at that time. Ferdowsi was almost middle age, in mid-30s, when he started Shahnameh. He was not that young. He definitely had some poems before, but we do not have any of that today. We only have Shahnameh from him. But it seems that he was a good poet. And another sign of that is that when you look at Shahnameh, these 50,000 lines, from the beginning to the end, you do not see any place of it which you can say that it's a weak poem and this is a strong poem. All of them are pretty good. They're marvelous. I mentioned just about these ahs, so do not focus much on that. But just a few verses that it's kind of like a style as well. So, and again, some people say that Bijanan Manager was first because of this. Some people believe, no, don't focus on that. Some people believe that Shahnameh was written in order, even though we know that that's not quite right. And we can tell that by following Ferdowsi's age in the book. This is another interesting one that I do not have time to talk about it today. I'm going to talk about it more next time. Again, I have not reached Sultan Mahmud yet. I'm going to talk about him next time. And I'm going to trace them via Ferdowsi's ages. Ferdowsi talks about his ages. He talks about his 60th, 61st, 63rd, 58th years of age, 71, 68. He talks about all of these in the book, and some of them are not quite in order. He talks about 63rd first, and then 61 down the road. That means that, okay, he did not necessarily say all of these stories in order. And we know that also from another, due to another reason. And that is that we know, I don't know if I mentioned that to you last time or not, Ferdowsi finished Shahnameh twice. So the official time that Ferdowsi finished Shahnameh is 1010. But 16 years earlier, which is, I don't know, 994, right? Did I do that math right? So 16 years earlier, he finished Shahnameh one more time because he was worried that he may not live long, and he did not want to leave his book unfinished. Maybe he was looking at the Daqiqi. He said, okay, this happened to him. I don't want that to happen to me. So maybe he skipped some of those stories. Or maybe he said some of the stories a bit brief. And then he came and just completed the work. And that's why when we see a gap, the age is backward, maybe it's due to that. So he came back and just added some stories. But what he says also, let me just say this verse, read it for you. It says, گشاد زبان و جوانیت هست، سخن گفتن پهلوانیت هست. This is what his friend says. He says that you are a great poet, and I would like you to do this job and write this book. So I'll bring you the book. And then we reach a point where Ferdowsi talks about his first patron. Somebody who said that, okay, oh, you're going to do this? Great job. Go do it and I'll support you. And who do you think that person was? He was Abu Mansur's son. His father ordered Shahnameh of Abu Mansur, and this guy now wants to turn that book into poetry. Of course, the son is going to support that. And he was a noble person. And he said that, okay, I'm going to support you. I'm going to give you as much that you do not need to rely on anyone else. Oh, fantastic. Right? You've heard the story of Ferdowsi becoming poor, Sultan Mahmud not giving money. So what about this guy? Yeah, he was there, and he talks about him in the book, but he disappeared shortly after. We know that he rebelled against the king, and then he was captured in a war, and he was put in a prison. He was there for 10 years, and nobody knew where he was. Ferdowsi mentions that. He says that Nabinam Hijo. Let me just read that from you. Oh, he says that نزو زنده بینم نه مرده نشان به دست نهنگان مردم کشان. He says that I do not see him anywhere, either alive or dead. And I'm sure that he is in the hand of the killers. And he's used the word nahang. Nahang is whale or shark, or so one of these big sea animals. He compared those folks to that killer, terrifying animal. This is that I know that they have him, but I don't know where he is. So he lost the only patron that he had, and then he had to do it himself. He was rich, and he lost all of his wealth throughout this journey. And we know that too, for sure, as a fact. Why? Not because Nizami Aruzi said it, not because anybody else said it. Ferdowsi said it himself. Ferdowsi talks about his age throughout the book. But he starts, I think, from 55 or 58, that he starts talking about his age for two reasons. Whenever he mentions that, he either mentions that I'm old and I do not see as well as I used to. I cannot walk as good. I have cane. He says that the age has given me cane. And he also talks about being poor. And he says it in a words that you want to cry. In one verse, he says that it's a beautiful day. Oh, beautiful sun is wonderful, is springtime. And Peter better have fun. And they better go and basically just cut a sheep's head and just uh, do barbecue, right? Just make good food and enjoy. Whoever can, go do it. I cannot. He says that I don't have the money. If you do, go have fun. And then we know that Ferdowsi was Dehkan. Dehkans were, I told you that they were not farmers, they were landowners. But the only source of income for them was their crops. And what is the worst thing for a crop? He talks about it. Hail. Tagarg. And he complains about it multiple times. He says that it's the end of the season. I have to pay tax. But look at it. It's hail. All my crops are ruined. How can I pay? And he says that I hope that Hoyai Qotaibe have a mercy on me. Hoyai Qotaibe is the tax collector of Tus. He says that I hope that he has some mercy for me. And the word tagarg in Persian rhymes with the word marg, death. And in that sentence, let me just read that verse for you. He says, tagarg آمد امسال بر سان مرگ مرا مرگ بهتر بودی زان تگرگ. Says that this year we had hail similar to death. And he said the death was better for me than the hail. And then at in another place, he says that I do not even have any log to burn. I cannot even make my house warm. I do not have food. And it says that in some places, he said that there's snow. The snow and my crops are ruined. And then one of the things he says, when this happens to him, still he wants to be a bit optimistic. And he says, bring me wine. Let me drink and not think about it. So, as I mentioned, he talks about these two things: his old age and just being weak and being poor. That's why he talks about his age. But we can learn a lot by knowing his age. And I'm going to show that to you. I'm going to do some math for you next time. But let me stop right here. So is almost the end of the introduction. One last thing I would mention is that once that's done, he says that that guy, the son of Abu Mansur, before his death, he told me that once the book is finished, dedicated to a king, do it. And then he says that, okay, I'm doing it. I'm dedicating that to Sultan Mahmud. I'll tell you more about Sultan Mahmud and Ferdowsi next time. Thank you so much for listening, and sorry for going over time. I'll be happy to answer your questions. We have a few in the chats. Fred Mirza says, are the stories in the Shahnameh written in a chronological order or according to Ferdowsi's mood, since the story of Manike and Bijan appears to be the initial inspiration to write the Shahnameh. Yeah, I think I touched on that. So the story that we have today in Shahnameh, they are in chronological order, from the ancient all the way to the end of Sasanian era. We have that. However, writing that, I also believe that he did not write them in order. Bijan Manish, as you mentioned, people believe that it was the first, and some other books again. So from his age, mentioning his age, also we note about that he was kind of out of order.
Also, I think in some of the legends, it's written, the one by Dr. Bahman Surti, that's English prose of the Shahnameh. He says that they originally, or somewhere, maybe Ramir Karanjia, says that originally Ferdowsi knew Avesta language, and he would sit by the river and write poems, and somebody saw that and said it was, and he started with Rustam and Sohrab and all that stuff. So are those legends, or is there also?
They were legends. So okay. Ferdowsi did not know Avesta, and he did not even know Pahlavi or Middle Persian. Okay. He did not do any of that. And so, as I mentioned, so one of the things in the Bijan and Manish prologue is that he asked his wife or his beloved to read a book from the Pahlavi book. Okay. And some people, again, this is legend, that his wife knew Pahlavi and he read it from, and he translated it for him, but that's not also the case. Because Pahlavi has two meanings. Pahlavi is also used as Pahlavani, the epic stories, epic book. Is not the book necessarily written in Pahlavi. So the word Pahlavi is used at least in 3 different forms in Shahnameh. One is to refer to the language, Pahlavi language. The other one is referring to Pahlavani and epic. And the third one is about city. Pahlu means city as well. And when it says that Pahlavi means, from city, right? Urban. So we do not have any evidence that he knew any of these languages. And this is another interesting thing. These are things that you may not even hear many places, is that there are few places in Shahnameh where Ferdowsi made funny mistakes. So, for example, he talks about a guy who was a servant to Zahak, and he says that he was named Kondro, and then he gives some, in the next verse, he said that because he was coming slow. Kondro means somebody who walks slow. But the root of this word is not Kondro, is Kandarv, who was a devil or a demon in Avesta. We have this creature in Yasht, is Kandarv. He read that wrong. He did not know that word. He read in the book, that Kandarv can do this, do that, and said Kondro. There was no a or a. It was that the Persian language is not like English. You do not have the vowels are not written. And you may not even believe this. At that age of Ferdowsi, even the dots were not written. You know the Persian language, have you seen that? There are some dots above and below some of the characters. Some of those were not even written. And that's the source of many misunderstandings and misinterpretations, because there were similar words. And then in later ages, when people wrote those versions of Shahnameh, they did not know what word it was. They guessed it, because at the time they actually added those dots. They guessed what the dots were. This is this much problem we have, which we're reading Shahnameh today.
I think it's the same thing even in Gujarati. When you pray, there's a letter called Ja, and if there are 3 dots, that becomes Ja. So Zarathustra or Zarathustra makes a big difference with those 3 dots. The other thing I had was that, I don't know if you're going to touch this later on, then maybe that's a thing, but the story I read was that he was originally invited by Muhammad Ghazni to the palace, and then the courtiers were jealous, so they sent him a letter, don't come, and then halfway through and all that.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I missed that.
Well, the story was that I read that he was originally invited because of his poetic skill by Muhammad Ghazni to come to his palace as a poet. And on his way, I mean, within the palace, the other poets in the palace were feeling kind of jealous. And so they told the clerk to write to Ferdowsi not to come. He got that, he was disappointed, and the clerk felt guilty. He sent another letter, no, please come. He came, they challenged him and all kinds of stuff. He was challenged for 4 days of debate and poetries and all. Is that true, or is that again a fable?
Absolutely not. These are just beautiful stories. So here's what I say. It's just I have a rule of thumb. If a story is very beautiful, it's not true. The real life is not such. So that's the problem I have with many people to forward all of these weird stories, not just about Ferdowsi, but anything in social media. So the stories of real life are not that beautiful and that interesting to tell. So you're going to hear the stories from even scientists. The story of Newton and the apple. No, that did not happen. The apple, drop on his head and say, oh, wait a minute. Oh, that was gravity. Come on. Right? So we have many of these stories. And I especially told you about these 2 stories that we have from these 2 sources, the 4 discourses and the history of Sistan, because these are the oldest one. And we already know they are not true. They don't make sense. But then, let alone things that come even ages later. We do not have any reference that tells of that. However, in general, that seems to be true, that the poets of Sultan Mahmud's court were jealous of him. This is quite possible, and it's possible that they basically did some fishy things to basically change Sultan Mahmud's mind about Ferdowsi, but that might not have been the only reason. So I'm going to talk about a few things that I believe that happened between the 2 next time. But I don't think that's this. Oh, they sad and they said they even have them. So there are 4. There's a couplet and there are 4 different parts of it that said, oh, Onsori said this, Asjodi said this, Farrohi said this, and then Ferdowsi said this. Even if you want, I can read that for you next time. So we have that, those 2 lines, which are quite interesting. But there are stories.
So even that story about his, like you said, that he's offered 60,000 gold by the Sharbat Kai, and then all that is all just the stories over there. It's not true.
Just stories.
So we don't know exactly he was in the prison in the end, or how did he die? We don't know how he died or what happened.
No, he was not in prison. So and that satire or this scolding of Sultan Mahmud, also many believe today that is not true. Ferdowsi did not do that, and there are some reasons for it. For example, one of the verses in that piece, in that satire of Sultan Mahmud, which is very vulgar. He insults his mom. Ferdowsi wrote 50,000 lines of poetry, and he did not do that into anybody. They were horrible characters in Shahnameh. He did not say that about anybody. How come he said that about Sultan Mahmud's mom? Or the other thing we have, for example, there is a verse in Shahnameh, they say that they attribute that to Ferdowsi. They said that Ferdowsi said, if anybody's against Ali, Muhammad and Ali, he is not his father's son. Ferdowsi did not say. Ferdowsi never did. So some of these I want to cover as part of the class, some of them a part of question as I don't know if I don't want to mention that here. So I have some interesting examples for you how clean his language was. I'll mention that next because I want to talk about it. So let's just leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. So Arya says that, oh, more says, okay, sure. Faribor says that wisdom is mentioned 164 times in the Gata. No other concept is mentioned that many times in the Gata. Maybe Ferdowsi is explaining the wisdom as in the Gatas. It's quite possible. So it may not be directly from Gata, but what we need to understand is that there is a civilization, there's a culture, and that people get and receive over time. What you guys teach your children is a Zoroastrian way of thinking and life. Even though you may not even mention Zarathustra or mention Gata, but you got that is in you without you even knowing it. The way that you raise your children is way different from people from the other part of the world. So if you think about that, the Iranian culture had many good traits in it. Herodotus talk about it in the history. He talks about this. He is not Iranian. He's Greek, and in some parts of his book, he's not so kind to Persians, but he says that Persians do not lie. It's a big thing for him. It's not a default to him. He knows people around him who lie, but he says the Persians do not lie. He says that. So where does that come from? It's part of the culture. And that may have come from Gata, may have come from Zarathustra. Is quite possible. But wisdom, as is praised by Ferdowsi, he's praising that as something that is dear to his heart, dear to his family, dear to his people. And that is possible that people learn it from Gata. But as I mentioned, he never mentioned that. He never mentions Gata. He never mentions that, oh, it was in this book, and that's what I'm saying. He doesn't say that, we don't know, but it's part of his culture, part of his belief system. Okay. In Hindi, we say Pehlavan for a strong person. Interesting. Okay, yeah. Oh, is it even in the Hindi language? Ah, that's interesting. So we only refer, when we say Pahlavan, yeah, we say a strong person also. But when you hear the word Pahlavan, you always think about Shahnameh. Shahnameh uses the word Pahlavan maybe, I don't know, 500 times. So I've done some research on Shahnameh. I did some statistical work because you know that my background is computer. I've done some, I may get a chance at some point to show you some of the results of that. I counted the words of Shahnameh, how frequent they are and where they actually appear. And the word that is used the most in Shahnameh, besides obviously the prepositions and just va, as, that, and things like that, the main keyword of Shahnameh is Shah. King is used more than any other word. And then words like Iran used a lot. And wisdom, kharat, is used a lot. I have that somewhere, which I've counted. So, yeah, Pahlavan is also one of those words, one of the first most prevalent words in China. All right, beautifully moving story. Thank you. Thank you, Maro. She has left. Could you please type the name of the Iranian scholar who has researched Ferdowsi for 40 plus years? Okay, let me write his name. Dr. Jalal Khaledi Mutlaq. This is the scholar who today many believe that he has the best edition of Shahnameh. I don't think that is translated. So Dick Davis's book, which I have here, see that because I don't know about my background, but anyway. So this, I think, is from based on Shahnameh of Moscow, the Moscow version of Shahnameh. I'll talk about different versions of Shahnameh. If Ferdowsi was fond of wine, would that not rule him out as a follower of Quran, since I believe that the Quran prohibits liquor? That's a good point. I don't know, to be honest. So these are things that have changed over time. So back then, Muslims drank, and it was not a big deal. And many of the basically hardline mindsets that we have today in religions like Islam, they're recent. They're not that old. And that's, so I'll talk about Sultan Mahmud next time. But one of the arguments that people say, give, that the problem between the two was not religion, Sunni and Shia, was because Shia and Sunnis lived happily together at that time. They did not have that much problem with each other. Sultan Mahmud was a Sunni, but his son-in-law was Shia. His own son-in-law was Shia. So he got that much hatred, would say. So that's why, so drinking wine was accepted at that time. At least Ferdowsi talks about it very clearly, very loudly in many places. If you want to argue that that was a sign that he was not a Muslim, who knows, maybe. Okay, the Muslims drank a long time ago, then why did they change the half sheen table to half seen? This is yet another thing that is not proven. Half sheen and half seen. We've heard about it. People talk about it. I don't see any evidence that this was half sheen and then it turned into half seen. Many believe that it was half chin. Chin means something that you put on a table. Michini. They say that it was half chin and then it turned into half seen. Half seen is recent, and I don't think that it was half shin. Even some of the pieces in the half shin are not even old words. They are just some very new words, and there's things that I don't think that shows that half shin was older than half seen. I have not seen any evidence of that, but this is just something that I've heard as well. That many Zoroastrians also do half shin because they say that, oh, half shin was a sharab, wine in it, and they wanted to change that to half shin. Yeah, I've heard that too.
Thank you.
So here's something that's, you know, where I'm coming from. So some people do not like my approach. Some people do. I'm always seeking the truth. And anything that I cannot prove for sure, I put some doubts in it. I look at it with some grains of salt. People love to believe stories. People love that because it's sweet. It's nice. It's good to tell. That's why I tell these stories too. I will tell you next time the story of these 4 verses that these 4 poets told each other. It's very beautiful. Or there is another story, the story of Saadi and Ferdowsi. This is wonderful. You know, Saadi is 300 years after Ferdowsi, the giant of Persian poetry. So it's a story that he had a dream. He actually wanted to say poems in the style of Ferdowsi. Right? So these are different styles of Persian poetry. We have the Khorasani style, which is Ferdowsi's style, and we have Iraqi style, which is Saadi's style. But he said that at some point, Saadi wanted to try to say poems in Khorasani style. And then he said that he had a dream one night, that Ferdowsi came to his dream, and he said that, what do you want to do? He said that, I want to say poem like you. And Ferdowsi said that, okay, tell me one. And Saadi says that خدا کشتی آنجا که خواهد برد اگر ناخدا جامه بر تن درد. خدا کشتی آنجا که خواهد برد اگر ناخدا جامه بر تن درد. What it says is that the God takes the ship wherever he wants. It doesn't matter even if the captain tears his own clothes. That's not up to him, it's up to God. That's the meaning of the verse. And then Ferdowsi said, oh, that was nice. But what about saying it as such? Instead of saying, خدا کشتی آنجا که خواهد برد اگر ناخدا جامه بر تن درد, say it like that. برد کشتی آنجا که خواهد خدای اگر جامه بر تن درد ناخدا. I don't know how much of it you can sense. You need to read a lot of Persian poetry so you know that, oh, this is Ferdowsi's style. This is Ferdowsi. So this is a very sweet story. It's very lovely. I love it. So because you see that the words are the same. He just changes the order of the words and then changes the style as a result. From Iraqi style to Khorasani style, to Shahnameh style. And said, oh, that's sad. He's like, oh, nice, cool. So it's just a story. But people love stories and then they tell it. That's why I'm in the camp of knowing those stories, loving those stories, but I say there are stories. Real life is not that sweet and that beautiful. Think about this. Oh, Sadi said that to something. Oh, listen, I had a dream last night and this happened. And the other guy said, oh, cool. Oh, let me write that down. And then over time, we know that it was actually Sadi. No, these are stories. Okay, so I would like to hear from you. So please open your mic if you want to say something.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shaheen.
Sorry, would you have any of your notes that you have got over there, a short, because I got kids from 13 to 15-year-old in my class in Zoroastrian Society of Ontario over here.
Mhm.
And Shahnameh is my favorite thing as well. Our classes are from 6-year-old to 15-year-old. So start from 6-year-old and then there are 5 different groups and mine is the last group. So they try to introduce Shahnameh when around Navjot time or Sudapushin time or something like that, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. And we try to spread the stories and the dynasties like Peshtadians and Kayanians are called by the younger ones. By the time they come to my class, it could be more Achaemenian or Sasanian kind of a history. And I always used those stories which I had as introduction to Shahnameh with Ferdowsi's life story. Maybe if you don't mind, I can send you my notes. You can scratch out what you think is a fable, whatever you think is the truth. I would really appreciate your feedback if you have the time. Otherwise, you know. Yeah.
So please send it to me. I'm not sure how much of it I'm able to do. And if I do, I may just, it would be easier for me to tell you about it, maybe just words instead of just typing that, but let's see.
Sure.
I'll be happy to do so. But my advice is, when you tell the story to young age, just to tell about Shahnameh, just focus on the stories. They need to get connected from the story side. If you start, oh, by the way, there was a guy like Ferdowsi and he did this, he did that, who cares? But if they hear about the stories first and they connect with it, and then they go after the writer, they want to know who the guy was. So what I did in these two type of work that I do, I mentioned that. So one of them are the audiobooks in which I tell the stories from the beginning. And in those stories, I tell all the stories. Some of them are violent, but that's okay. I tell them in simple words, in both English and Persian. The English part is my daughter's word. And in that, that might be useful for maybe kids over 10 years old. So. But for smaller kids, I have these children's stories, which are non-violent whatsoever. So these are the story of Hushang, the story of Zal and Rudabe, and the story of the birth of Rostam. This is the 4th book that I'm working on right now. And so these are the stories that people from the young age can connect to. So my my nephew is, I think, 2.5 years or 3 years old. My brother just sent me a recording of him reading my book. I'm just having my book. He said, Hu Shang Shah said this and that. It was so beautiful. He does not understand many of these things, but he says Hu Shang Shah. The word Hu Shang is inscribed in his mind. And over the years, he will understand it in a deeper level. But he knows the name and he knows his connection with fire, discovery of fire, whatever that is. Right. So that's the way I think this is the approach that is good for youth, I suggest.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anyone else want to say something? Any question?
I just want to say thank you for your time and your hard work and spreading the knowledge. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So by the way, I really enjoy seeing your faces. So I get my energy from you guys. I really appreciate it. I see that you are very engaged and you're listening intently. I really appreciate that. I really love this kind of audience, and I really appreciate there are not many people here, but whoever is here, I know that you want to learn, you want to know more about Shahnameh, and I really appreciate that. I really love it. Thank you so much.
You are a great story.